New York was never just a city of trade. It was a city of class, where wealth and power were planted in the soil long before skyscrapers rose. This city carried the story of merchants, farmers, enslaved laborers, and governors, a story of how wealth was not only earned but controlled, and a story of how class divisions began shaping the destiny of New York from its earliest days. Let's step back into the 1600s, when the city was not yet called New York, but New Amsterdam. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company sent settlers to the tip of Manhattan Island. Their goal was clear: profit. They wanted furs, trade routes, and control of the Hudson River. The promise was wealth. But who would hold it? That question would soon divide the community. At first, the settlement was small: wooden houses, dirt paths, and a fort. Yet behind those simple structures was a system of power. The company controlled land, merchants controlled trade, ordinary settlers had little say. How would this imbalance grow? The answer lies in the patroonship system. The Dutch introduced patroonships in 1629. Wealthy investors could claim huge estates if they brought settlers to farm the land. These patrons became lords of their territory. Tenants worked for them, often with little chance to rise. The promise of opportunity for all was delivered only to a few. One famous patron was Kilian van Rensselaer, who controlled land near present-day Albany. His estate stretched for miles. Tenants paid rent and gave part of their harvest. This was not freedom, it was hierarchy. Already, wealth was shaping class. Already, New York was becoming a place where privilege was inherited. Manhattan's economy grew fast. Furs from the interior, shipped by Native American traders, brought profit. Merchants grew rich. But the Dutch West India Company wanted control. Governors like Peter Stuyvesant enforced strict rules. He taxed trade, regulated prices, and punished dissent. Merchants wanted freedom, governors wanted order. The clash created controversy. Wealth was not only about money, it was about power, and power was contested. But another group was entering the story. They were the enslaved Africans. By the 1620s and 1630s, Africans were brought to New Amsterdam. Some were enslaved, some were indentured. They built roads, cleared land, and worked in households. Their labor was essential, yet their class was the lowest. They had no rights. Wealth was built on their backs, but they received none of it. In 1644, some Africans petitioned for freedom. The company granted half freedom. They could live independently but had to pay yearly dues and return labor when called. It reveals that wealth in New York was tied to exploitation. Class was not only about rich and poor settlers, it was also about race. Another group shaped the story: Native Americans. The Dutch traded with them but also fought them. Land was taken, often through unfair deals. One famous moment was the purchase of Manhattan in 1626, when Peter Minuit supposedly bought the island for goods worth 60 guilders. The story is debated, but the result is clear. Native Americans lost land, settlers gained wealth. This raises a question: who benefited most? Merchants and landowners. Who lost most? Native Americans and enslaved Africans. How would this imbalance grow when the English arrived? In 1664, English warships sailed into the harbor of New Amsterdam. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, tried to rally resistance, but merchants and settlers, tired of company rule, chose surrender. The English seized the colony without bloodshed and renamed it New York, honoring the Duke of York, brother of King Charles II. This was more than a change of name. It was a turning point. Wealth and class would now follow English patterns, reshaping the city's destiny. The English crown granted vast tracts of land to loyal supporters. These grants created manorial estates modeled on English aristocracy. Families such as the Livingstons, Phillipses, and Morris clan gained enormous holdings in the Hudson Valley. Their estates stretched for miles, with hundreds of tenant farmers bound to pay rent in wheat, livestock, or labor. The promise of opportunity for settlers was again delivered only to elites. What did this mean for ordinary workers? It meant dependence, rent, and limited freedom. Tenants could farm, but they could not own. Their children inherited debt, not land. Meanwhile, merchants flourished under English rule. The port of New York became a hub in the Atlantic world. Ships carried flour, timber, and furs outward, while sugar, rum, molasses, and enslaved Africans came inward. The city was tied tightly into the Atlantic trade network. Merchants grew richer, their fortunes built on shipping and credit. The Livingstons, Delanceys, and Van Cortlandts controlled trade. Their houses stood tall near the waterfront, their wealth visible in imported furniture, silverware, and fine clothing. The promise was prosperity, but who received it? Not the workers. Sailors, dockhands, and artisans earned little. They lived in crowded neighborhoods such as the East Ward, where wooden houses leaned against one another and streets were muddy. Sailors risked storms and disease for wages often withheld. By the late 1600s, New York was visibly divided. Wealthy families built brick houses near the waterfront, decorated with imported furniture and silverware. They wore fine clothes from London and dined on sugar, tea, and wine. Poor families lived in huts with dirt floors, ate bread and porridge, and worked endlessly. Enslaved Africans, whose numbers grew steadily after 1664, lived in crowded quarters, often harsh and cold. They labored in households, docks, and farms, forming the hidden foundation of wealth. Native Americans, once central to trade, were pushed further away as land was seized and settlements expanded. Class was visible everywhere. In churches, wealthy families sat in front pews, their names carved into benches. Poor families sat in the back. Enslaved Africans often stood outside. In markets, merchants controlled prices, squeezing artisans and farmers. In courts, elites had influence, shaping laws to protect property and privilege. Would this system last, or would it face challenges? The seeds of resistance were already planted, in tenant unrest, in enslaved petitions for freedom, and in the growing anger of workers. The story of wealth and class in New York was far from settled. New York's harbor became one of the busiest in the colonies. By the early 1700s, ships crowded the docks, carrying flour, timber, and furs outward, while sugar, rum, molasses, and enslaved Africans came inward. The city was tied tightly into the Atlantic trade network. Merchants grew richer, their fortunes built on shipping and credit. The Livingstons, Delanceys, and Van Cortlandts controlled trade. Their houses stood tall near the waterfront, their wealth visible in imported furniture, silverware, and fine clothing. The promise was prosperity, but who received it? Not the workers. Sailors, dockhands, and artisans earned little. They lived in crowded neighborhoods such as the East Ward, where wooden houses leaned against one another and streets were muddy. Sailors risked storms, disease, and violence at sea, only to return home unpaid or cheated. Their anger grew. In 1712 and later decades, sailors rioted over unpaid wages and harsh conditions. They attacked merchants, broke into warehouses, and demanded justice. These riots revealed a truth. Wealth was concentrated, class divisions were sharp, and ordinary workers were ready to fight. The city's elites feared the unrest, but they did not change the system. On April 6, 1712, about 22 enslaved Africans set fire to a building in New York. When whites came to put out the flames, the rebels attacked with guns and knives. 9 whites were killed. The revolt was crushed quickly, but its impact was huge. 21 Africans were executed, some by hanging, others by burning. Others were punished severely. The promise of freedom was denied, but the revolts delivered a message. Enslaved people would resist, even at the cost of their lives. After the revolt, New York passed strict laws. Enslaved Africans could not gather in groups larger than 3, own property, or carry weapons. Curfews were enforced. Punishments were brutal: whipping, branding, execution. Wealthy families tightened control, class divisions deepened. In 1741, a series of fires broke out across New York. Panic spread. Authorities accused enslaved Africans and poor whites of plotting to burn the city and kill elites. Trials followed. More than 30 Africans were executed, some burned at the stake in public squares. Poor whites, including indentured servants, were also punished, some deported, others hanged. Was there truly a conspiracy? Historians debate. Some argue the fires were accidental, others that the evidence was weak, but the result was clear. Fear of revolt haunted the wealthy. While riots and revolts shook the streets, politics divided elites. Two factions rose: the court party, tied to royal governors, and the country party, tied to merchants and landowners. They fought over taxes, trade, and control. This struggle revealed another truth: wealth was not united. Elites themselves battled for power. How did ordinary people fit in? Often they were caught in the middle. In the Hudson Valley, tenants rebelled against landlords. They refused to pay rent, destroyed property, and demanded rights. These riots showed that class conflict was not only in the city, it spread to the countryside. Wealthy landlords faced angry tenants. In the 18th century, class was visible in daily life. Wealthy families wore silk and imported clothes. Poor workers wore rough linen. Wealthy families ate sugar and tea. Poor families ate bread and porridge. Enslaved Africans ate scraps. Churches reflected class. Wealthy families sat in front pews. Poor families sat in the back. Enslaved Africans often stood outside. In 1735, the trial of John Peter Zenger, a printer, challenged elite control. He was accused of libel for criticizing the governor. His acquittal was a victory for free press, but also revealed tension between elites and ordinary citizens. Poor whites sometimes joined enslaved Africans in resistance, as in the 1741 conspiracy. Class divisions could cross racial lines. Women in merchant families managed shops and trade when husbands were away. Their role in wealth was often hidden but real. What do these facts reveal? That wealth and class were complex, not simple. When the revolution began in 1775, patriots promised freedom from British rule. They spoke of rights, equality, and independence. But beneath the speeches lay a question: would liberty extend to all classes? The answer was complicated. Wealthy merchants and landowners often supported independence, hoping to protect their property from royal taxes. Poor workers joined militias, hoping for change. Enslaved Africans saw a chance for freedom. Native Americans faced choices of alliance. The promise was liberty, but it would be delivered unevenly. New York was deeply divided. Many wealthy families remained loyal to Britain. They feared losing land and trade. These loyalists included merchants, aristocrats, and officials. On the other side were patriots, often smaller merchants, artisans, and farmers. This struggle tore communities apart. Families split, neighbors fought. Patriot leaders seized loyalist estates. Land, houses, and businesses were taken. Some loyalists fled to Canada or Britain. Their wealth vanished. This was a turning point. Property shifted from one class to another. But did ordinary workers benefit? Not much. Confiscated land often went to patriot elites, not the poor. Wealth was reshaped, but inequality remained. From 1776 to 1783, New York City was occupied by British forces. It became their headquarters. Wealthy loyalists thrived under British protection. Merchants traded with the army. But ordinary citizens suffered. Food was scarce. Prices rose. Poverty spread. Enslaved Africans found opportunity. The British promised freedom to those who fled patriot masters. Thousands escaped. What happened after the war? Many were evacuated to Canada or the Caribbean, but freedom was partial and uncertain.
The revolution opened doors. Some enslaved Africans gained freedom by joining the British. Others served in patriot militias, hoping for liberty. Yet most remained enslaved. The revolution promised freedom, but delivered it unevenly. Wealth and class still rested on slavery. Native Americans faced a dilemma. Some allied with the British, hoping to protect land. Others sided with patriots. But in the end, both sides took native land. The revolution accelerated displacement. Wealth for settlers meant loss for native peoples. Women played roles often overlooked. They managed farms, shops, and households, while men fought in militias or served in the Continental Army. Without their labor, families would have starved and communities would have collapsed. What kinds of roles did they take on? The answer? Nearly every responsibility left behind by men. Some women became symbols of clever resistance. Mary Lindley Murray, a wealthy widow in Manhattan, famously entertained British officers with food and conversation in 1776. While she delayed them, American troops escaped. Her act of hospitality became a quiet but powerful moment of defiance. Were there others? Yes, many women used wit and courage to protect their families and aid the patriot cause. Wealthy women protected estates. They oversaw farms, collected rents, and managed enslaved laborers. They kept accounts, negotiated with merchants, and defended property from seizure. Their wealth gave them tools, but also burdens. If husbands or sons were loyalists, estates could be confiscated. If they were patriots, estates could be raided. Poor women struggled to feed families. They baked bread, sewed clothes, and sold goods in markets. Some followed armies as camp followers, cooking, washing, and nursing soldiers. Others faced hunger when prices soared. In New York City, under British occupation, poor women lined up for scarce supplies, often cheated by merchants. In 1777, women in New York joined food riots, demanding fair prices for flour. They stormed markets, seized supplies, and forced merchants to sell at lower rates. These riots revealed a truth. Women were not passive. They fought for survival. Women also carried messages, smuggled supplies, and hid weapons. Some acted as spies. Anna Strong on Long Island used laundry hung on a clothesline to signal patriot agents in the Culper spy ring. Her coded signals helped pass intelligence to George Washington. For enslaved women, the revolution brought both hope and hardship. Some fled to British lines seeking freedom. Others remained in bondage, forced to labor for loyalist or patriot households. Their struggle was double, against slavery and against poverty. During occupation, New York City was crowded with soldiers, refugees, and prisoners. Class divisions sharpened. Wealthy loyalists lived comfortably. Poor workers faced hunger. Enslaved Africans sought escape. When Britain surrendered, loyalists fled. Their property was redistributed. Patriot elites gained land and power. Merchants tied to independence rose. Poor workers gained little. Enslaved Africans saw promises broken. Native Americans lost more land. Independence gave New York a new flag, but it did not erase old hierarchies of wealth and class. The revolution had ended. Loyalists were gone. Patriots held power, but the promise of liberty was uneven. After 1783, New York entered a new phase. The city became the capital of the United States for a brief time. Merchants, lawyers, and politicians gathered. The promise was opportunity. A new elite class emerged, patriot leaders who had gained land and influence. Families like the Livingstons, Schuylers, and Clintons rose. They controlled politics and trade. Did ordinary workers benefit? Not much. Inequality continued. Loyalist estates had been confiscated during the Revolution. These lands were redistributed, but who received them? Patriot elites. Speculators bought property. Wealth concentrated again. Poor farmers hoped for land but often failed. That independence reshaped wealth but did not equalize it. New York's port grew rapidly. Ships carried flour, timber, and goods to Europe and the Caribbean. Merchants gained wealth. Banks and insurance companies formed. The promise was prosperity. But artisans and laborers struggled. Wages were low. Prices were high. New York politics divided between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Federalists, often wealthy merchants, supported strong government and trade. Democratic Republicans, often farmers and artisans, opposed elite control.
This division revealed class tensions. Wealthy elites dominated offices. Ordinary workers demanded representation. But this played out through elections, riots, and factional battles. In the Hudson Valley, tenants still faced landlords. They hoped independence would bring land reform. But landlords kept estates. Tenants rioted, refused rent, and demanded rights. Slavery continued in New York after the Revolution. Enslaved Africans worked in households, farms, and docks. Wealthy families relied on their labor. The promise of liberty was denied. In 1799, New York passed a gradual emancipation law. Children born to enslaved mothers would be freed after years of service. Native Americans lost land as settlers expanded. Treaties were broken, territory was seized. Wealth for settlers meant loss for native peoples. That independence deepened displacement. Women managed households and businesses. Some inherited property, but legal rights were limited. Wealthy women influenced politics through family ties. Poor women worked in markets and shops. Did independence change their class position? Not legally, but socially their role grew. In post-revolution New York, class was visible. Wealthy elites lived in mansions, wore fine clothes, and dined on imported goods. Poor workers lived in crowded neighborhoods, ate simple meals, and struggled. Enslaved Africans lived in harsh quarters. By the dawn of the 1800s, New York was no longer just a port. It was becoming the financial heart of America. The revolution had ended, independence was secured, and now wealth was shifting again. New York's harbor bustled with ships. Flour, timber, and cotton flowed outward. Manufactured goods, sugar, and coffee flowed inward. Merchants grew rich. The promise was prosperity. But prosperity was uneven. Wealth concentrated in merchant families. Workers earned little. How would this imbalance grow? Through banking. In 1784, the Bank of New York was founded. It became a center of finance. Other banks followed. Insurance companies and stock exchanges grew. Wealthy merchants invested. Their power expanded. What did this mean for ordinary workers? They had little access to credit. Banking served elites. Class divisions widened. In 1817, construction began on the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. It connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. The promise was huge. Trade expanded, goods flowed, and New York became the gateway to the West. Merchants and investors gained wealth. Farmers shipped crops, but workers dug the canal under harsh conditions. Who benefited most? Elites. Who suffered most? Laborers. Families like the Astors rose. John Jacob Astor built wealth through fur trade and real estate. His fortune made him one of the richest men in America. Merchant princes controlled land, banks, and trade. A new elite emerged, towering above ordinary workers. Artisans formed associations. They demanded fair wages and shorter hours. Workers protested against rising prices. The promise was rights. But elites resisted. Workers struggled. Slavery continued in New York until gradual emancipation ended in 1827. Enslaved Africans worked in households and farms. Free black communities grew, building churches and schools. But discrimination remained. Wealth was denied. Immigrants arrived from Europe. Irish and German workers filled docks and factories. The promise was opportunity. But they faced poverty and discrimination. Wealthy elites controlled jobs. In early 19th century New York, class was visible. Wealthy elites lived in mansions, wore fine clothes, and dined on imported goods. Workers lived in crowded tenements, ate simple meals, and labored long hours. Free blacks faced discrimination. Immigrants struggled. By the 1810s and 1820s, Wall Street became the center of finance. Brokers gathered under a buttonwood tree to trade stocks. The New York Stock Exchange grew. Wealth concentrated in investors. What did this mean for class? Finance created fortunes for elites, but widened inequality. By the 1840s, New York was no longer just a port of trade. It was a city of machines, immigrants, and stark inequality.
This was the age of industry. Factories hummed, ships crowded the harbor, and immigrants poured in. Factories rose across New York. Textiles, ironworks, and printing presses filled the city. The promise was jobs. Industry created wealth for owners. But workers faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Immigrants arrived in huge numbers. Irish fled famine. Germans fled political turmoil. They crowded into tenements. The promise was opportunity, but reality was poverty. Tenements were cramped, dark, and unsanitary. Disease spread. Tenements housed families in single rooms. Water was scarce. Sewage filled streets. Children worked in factories. Wealthy elites lived in mansions uptown. The class divisions were visible in daily life. Industrialists gained wealth. They owned factories, banks, and shipping lines. Families like the Astors expanded fortunes through real estate. Merchant princes became industrial elites. The promise was fortune. What did this mean for workers? Exploitation. Wealth concentrated at the top. Workers protested, strikes erupted. They demanded shorter hours and better pay. Labor unions grew. The promise was rights. But elites resisted. Police crushed protests. Did workers succeed? Slowly. Some reforms came, but inequality remained. By the mid-19th century, slavery had ended in New York. Free black communities grew. They built churches, schools, and businesses. The promise was freedom. But discrimination persisted. Jobs were scarce, housing was limited. Women worked in factories, shops, and households. Poor women labored long hours. Wealthy women managed estates. The promise was independence, but legal rights were limited. Did industry change women's class position? Not legally, but socially their role expanded. In mid-19th century New York, class was visible. Wealthy elites dined in grand halls. Workers ate bread and soup. Immigrants crowded tenements. Free blacks faced discrimination. Women labored.